He was still looking at the scans. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the computer tower and the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to mock the concept of time. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the scent of waiting. Dr. James Mitchell sat across from me, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. He had been staring at the images of my lungs for a long time. Too long. In the 5 years I had known him, I had learned to read his silence. There was the bad news silence, heavy and suffocating, where he would organize his words carefully before shattering your world. There was the uncertainty silence, where he would chew on his lower lip, calculating odds. But this silence was different. It was lighter. He finally turned away from the screen. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture of exhaustion. But when he looked at me, his eyes were clear. "Now you live," he said simply. The words hung in the air, foreign and immense. "What? The scans are clear, Samuel. Not just stable, clear. No evidence of disease." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "You go back to your life. You build things. You do everything you couldn't do while you were in treatment. And you?" I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. For 5 years, this man had been the center of my gravity. My survival had been tethered to his intellect, his decisions, his hands. The idea of unmooring myself felt less like freedom and more like falling. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at me with a professional, practiced distance that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I move on to the next patient. That's what I do." "So that's it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. 5 years, chemo, radiation, surgeries, and now a handshake. "I've already transferred your follow-up care to Dr. Evans in the survivorship clinic," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's standard protocol for cases like yours entering long-term remission. You don't need an oncologist anymore, Samuel. You need to exist, to rebuild, to figure out who you are when survival isn't the only goal." He stood up and extended his hand. I took it. It was warm. "Have a good life, Samuel." "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell." I walked out of the office, down the long sterile corridor, and out into the blinding afternoon sun. I was free, and I had never felt more alone. Part 2. The year between. After my final appointment, I didn't see Dr. Mitchell for a year. This was by design. His design, I later realized. By transferring my care to Dr. Evans, he had effectively removed himself from my orbit. He had built a wall of professionalism so high that I couldn't climb it. I moved back to the city proper, leaving the apartment near the hospital that had smelled of sickness. I got a job at a prestigious architectural firm, the kind of place where people worried about font sizes and zoning laws, rather than white blood cell counts. I started dating again, awkward dinners with men who complained about traffic or the weather, oblivious to the miracle of simply drawing a breath without pain. I started living the life I thought I'd lost. But I thought about him constantly. It was involuntary, like a phantom limb. I'd be at a dinner party, laughing at a joke, and suddenly I'd think about how Dr. Mitchell looked when he studied my blood work. I'd be standing on a construction site, looking at blueprints, and remember the precise, calming cadence of his voice, explaining a complex procedure. I'd be anywhere, doing anything, and suddenly I'd be back in that oncology office, watching him deliver news that could destroy a person, yet doing it with such grace that it felt bearable. I missed him, not just as a doctor, but as the witness to my life. He was the only person who truly knew the cost of my survival. Exactly 12 months after my discharge, my phone buzzed. It was my friend Maria, an old college roommate who worked in medical administration. "There's a medical ethics lecture at the university tonight. The burden of truth in oncology, free wine and cheese. Come, I need a buffer from my boss." I almost said no. I was tired, but the topic tugged at something inside me. "Who's the speaker?" Some hotshot from the research institute, Dr. James Mitchell. My heart hammered against my ribs. "I'll be there." The auditorium was packed. I sat in the back row, hidden in the shadows. When he walked onto the stage, he looked different. He wasn't wearing the white coat. He was in a charcoal suit, tailored and sharp. He looked less like a savior and more like a man. I listened to him talk for an hour. He spoke about the responsibility of an oncologist to tell the truth while maintaining hope. He spoke about the emotional tax of the profession. "We are taught to be objective," he said to the crowd, his voice amplified but intimate. "We are taught that detachment is necessary for good judgment. But how do you remain detached when you are fighting for a life? There is a thin line between being a professional and being human. And sometimes the most ethical thing you can do is admit that you care too much." The audience applauded. I sat frozen. When the lecture ended and the Q&A finished, people swarmed the stage. I didn't approach him. I couldn't. The gap between us felt too wide. I turned and started to head for the exit, weaving through the students and doctors. Samuel. The voice cut through the noise. I stopped. I turned around. He was standing at the edge of the stage, ignoring a department head who was trying to shake his hand. He was looking right at me. He jumped down from the stage in an uncharacteristically impulsive move and walked toward me, weaving through the crowd. I thought that was you, he said, slightly out of breath. He stopped 2 feet away. How are you? Good, I said, my throat dry. Really good. Work's been busy. Life's been good. Yeah, good. He smiled, and it was the same smile he'd given me when he said my scans were clear. A smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was a smile of genuine relief. I'm glad, he said quietly. I think about my patients after they leave. Wonder how they're doing, especially the ones who fight as hard as you did. You think about me? I asked. The air shifted. The professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. Of course, you were my patient for 5 years. We went through a lot. Of course I think about you. That's not what I meant, I said, emboldened by the year of silence. He knew I was asking something bigger. He looked around at the lingering crowd, at the students sipping cheap wine, at the public nature of the space. I can't talk about this here, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. And I probably shouldn't talk about it anywhere. Why not? Because you were my patient. Because there are rules. Because, he stopped, running a hand through his hair. Because I don't want to complicate your life now that you finally have it back. Too late, I said. It's already complicated. He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something. Then, he sighed. I have to go to this faculty dinner. But he hesitated. But, I'm glad you're alive, Samuel. I'm really glad. He turned and walked away before I could say another word. Part 3, the complication. He called me a week later. I had spent the week dissecting every micro-expression from our meeting, analyzing his tone like it was a diagnostic test. When his number appeared on my screen, a number I realized he must have looked up in my old file. A violation in itself. I nearly dropped the phone. I've been thinking about what you said. He started. No greeting. No preamble. Just straight to the wound. About it being too late. Yeah? I sat down on my kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice was strained, like he was forcing the words out against his better judgment. I need to tell you that what I feel isn't appropriate. It's not professional. It is, by definition, a violation of the doctor-patient boundary. The doctor-patient relationship is over, I said. It's been over for a year. I'm with Dr. Evans now. But the feelings happened during that relationship, he insisted. I was your doctor for 5 years. I held your life in my hands. I shouldn't have. He stopped, his breath hitching. I shouldn't have let myself feel anything beyond clinical concern, did you? I asked softly. Let yourself feel something. Silence stretched over the line. Heavy, pregnant silence. Yes, he said finally. The word was a surrender. Yes, I did. The moment I saw you walk into my office 5 years ago, this terrified young man, trying so hard to be brave, I knew I was in trouble. And for 5 years, I maintained professional boundaries with an iron grip because that's what you needed. You needed a doctor you could trust implicitly, not a doctor who was distracted by being in love with you. The world stopped. The kitchen, the city outside, the architectural plans on my table, everything vanished. I couldn't speak. I whispered. But now you're in remission, he continued, his voice picking up speed, as if he needed to get this out before he lost his nerve. Now you're not my patient. Now the relationship is technically over. And I'm telling you this not because I expect you to feel anything back, or because I'm asking for anything. I'm telling you because I can't keep lying to myself about why I transferred your care. I didn't send you to Dr. Evans just because of protocol. I sent you away because I couldn't look at you anymore without wanting to cross that line. I want to see you, I said. Samuel, please think about this. The power dynamic. It doesn't just vanish. I don't care about the dynamic. I care about the man who saved my life. And I want to see him. Samuel, not as a doctor and patient, I interrupted. As two adults. Two men who survived 5 years of the hardest thing either of us has experienced. Meet me. Part 4. The first date. We met at a small, independent coffee shop 2 blocks from a hospital, close enough to feel familiar, far enough to feel safe. It was raining, a gray, washing rain that blurred the windows. Seeing him sitting there in a casual sweater, stirring a cappuccino, felt surreal. We'd sat in his office countless times, but always with a heavy mahogany desk between us. Always with the barrier of his white coat. Always with the specter of death hovering in the corner. Now, there was just steam and the smell of roasted beans. I sat down. This is weird, James said immediately. Extremely, I agreed. I keep wanting to ask you clinical questions. How you're sleeping. How your appetite is. If you're experiencing any fatigue or night sweats. I'm sleeping great. Eating too much. The only unusual symptom is that I'm incredibly nervous. Because I'm on a date with my former oncologist. He laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound I'd never heard before. Is that what this is, a date? I think so, I said. Unless you're going to tell me this is a medical consultation. If it were a medical consultation, I'd have to bill your insurance, and the paperwork is a nightmare. We talked for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the cancer at first. We talked about architecture. He told me he loved brutalist design, which made me question his taste but charmed me nonetheless. I told him about my family, about the books I read when I was too sick to move. But eventually, the conversation drifted back to the thing that bound us. I couldn't let myself look at you sometimes, he admitted, tracing the rim of his cup. During the radiation weeks, you look so fragile. I had to keep my face completely neutral. I had to hear about your fears and your pain, and I had to respond like a clinician. Take this for the nausea. This pain is normal. When what I wanted to say was, I am so sorry this is happening to you, and I would take it away if I could. I knew, I said softly. He looked up, surprised. What? I knew you cared. Maybe not that you were in love with me, but I knew it was more than just a job. I could see it in how careful you were. How you explained every option 3 times until I understood. How you never pushed me toward a particular treatment but let me choose. You were giving me agency because you respected me as a person, not just a set of lungs to be fixed. That's not the same as being in love. No, I said, reaching across the table to cover his hand with mine. His skin was electric against mine, but it was the foundation for it. It was enough to make me feel like I mattered, like my life was worth fighting for. You didn't just give me medicine, James. You gave me a reason to stay. He turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with mine. You saved me too, Samuel. You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. Part 5. The problem. Dating James was perfect and impossible at the same time. Perfect because he got it. He understood what 5 years of cancer treatment had done to my body and my psyche. He didn't flinch at the scars. He understood the sudden waves of fatigue. He understood the trauma of thinking you're going to die, and the survivor's guilt of living when others in the waiting room didn't. I didn't have to explain my history to him. He had written it. Impossible because he was still a senior attending physician at the hospital where I had been treated, and the ethics board had strict, archaic rules about doctor-patient relationships. It doesn't matter that you're not my patient anymore, James explained one night as we cooked dinner at my apartment. The American Medical Association and our hospital board views these relationships with extreme suspicion. They worry about exploitation, about the idea that a patient can never truly consent because of the past dependency. But that's infantilizing, I argued, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. I'm 32 years old. I'm of sound mind. I'm not a victim. To them, you are a former dependent, James said warily. So, we have to be careful. We don't go to the hospital together. We don't mention the relationship to anyone at work. We live like this is a secret for 6 months. We did exactly that. We lived in a bubble. We met at restaurants in different neighborhoods. We went to movies in the next town over. We spent nights at my apartment where no one would see us. We were happy, deliriously so. But we were also hiding, and the secrecy began to weigh on us. It unraveled on a Tuesday. We were at a small Italian restaurant, celebrating 6 months of being together. We thought we were safe. We were holding hands across the table, laughing. Dr. Mitchell. James froze. He pulled his hand away as if burned. Standing by our table was a nurse from the oncology ward, Sheila. She looked from James to me, and then her eyes widened in recognition. Samuel? Oh my God, I didn't recognize you with the hair and looking so healthy. Hi, Sheila, I said, trying to smile. I didn't know you two. Kept in touch, she said, her gaze darting between us, processing the candle, the wine. The intimacy. We just ran into each other, James said quickly. Too quickly. Just catching up. Sheila nodded slowly. Right. Well, have a good night. She walked away, but we knew. The damage was done. Within a week, the rumors had spread through the department like a virus. The hospital administration didn't take long to react. The ethics board launched a formal investigation. The questions were ugly. Did Dr. Mitchell abuse his position? Did he groom the patient? Did the relationship start before the discharge? Was his medical judgment compromised? It was ridiculous. I was the one who had approached him at the lecture. He had maintained complete professionalism during every second of my treatment. but the hospital saw a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen. A PR nightmare. James was called into a meeting with the hospital administration and the legal team. He called me afterward from his car. Asterisk, they're asking me to resign, he said, his voice hollow. What? No. That's insane. You're their best oncologist. Fair doesn't matter, Samuel, he said, sounding defeated. What matters is perception. And the perception is that I compromise my professional boundaries. They said if I resign quietly, they won't report it to the medical licensing board. If I fight it, they'll destroy my career. But you didn't do anything wrong. You saved my life. And now I'm the doctor who fell in love with his patient. That's the narrative. They can't have that. Part 6. The choice. James came over that night. He looked 10 years older. He sat on my couch and gave me an out. You should tell them you want nothing to do with me, he said. We can tell them I pursued you, that you were uncomfortable, and that it's over. Or better yet, tell them I pressured you, that you were vulnerable and I took advantage. I'm not going to do that, I said, horrified. Samuel, listen to me. I'm being destroyed. The hospital is trying to force me out. My colleagues are looking at me like I'm a predator. You can save yourself from this mess by distancing yourself. By lying. I interrupted, standing up. By throwing you under the bus. By becoming exactly the kind of victim they're accusing you of making me. Yes, he said. Yes, do that. If it saves your reputation. If it keeps you out of this ugly spotlight. Do it. No. Samuel, no, James. I spent 5 years fighting for my life. I didn't fight that hard just to be a coward now. Instead, I did something different. I contacted the hospital the next morning. I requested to monitor a hearing with the ethics board. 2 days later, I sat in a conference room facing 5 people in suits. James was there, sitting off to the side, looking pale. He shook his head slightly when I walked in, silently begging me not to do this. I ignored him. Mr. Peterson, the head of the board, said, "You understand you are not on trial here. You are the potential victim." "I am not a victim," I said clearly, "and that is why I am here." I took a breath. "I need to clarify the timeline and the nature of this relationship. Because it seems you have written a fiction that doesn't match my reality. I was Dr. Mitchell's patient for 5 years. For 5 years, he was nothing but a doctor. He was precise, professional, and distant. He never touched me inappropriately. He never made a comment that wasn't medical. He saved my life with his brain and his discipline." I looked at James. My treatment ended 1 year before we spoke personally. I was discharged. I was seen by Dr. Evans. A full year passed where I did not see or speak to Dr. Mitchell. When we met again, it was at a public lecture. I approached him. I initiated the conversation, and even then, he tried to push me away. I turned back to the board. He told me there was an ethics issue. He told me it was complicated. He gave me every opportunity to walk away. He tried to protect the integrity of his profession over his own happiness. I chose not to walk away. I am an adult man. I survived cancer. I am capable of deciding who I love. Mr. Peterson, one of the board members, interjected. The concern is the power imbalance. You may feel you chose this, but the gratitude you feel for him saving your life can be confused with romantic love. It's called transference. I know what transference is, I snapped. And I know the difference between gratitude and love. I am grateful to the nurses. I am grateful to the surgeon. I am grateful to Dr. Evans. I am not in love with them. I am in love with James Mitchell because he treats me with respect, because he understands pain, and because he is a good man. To punish him for being human, after he gave 5 years of flawless service to this hospital, is not ethical. It is bureaucratic cruelty. He didn't abuse a power dynamic, I finished, my voice shaking with emotion. He respected one. Even after the relationship was over, he was uncomfortable with it because he understood the stakes. That's not predatory. That is the definition of ethical. The room was silent. The hospital didn't fire him. They couldn't. Not after my testimony and the threat of a wrongful termination lawsuit that my lawyer friend drafted the next day. The ethics board cleared him of formal wrongdoing. However, the environment at the hospital became toxic. He wasn't fired, but he was sidelined. The trust was fractured. But they did something else. They used our case to review their policies. They recommended new guidelines about doctor-patient relationships after discharge, establishing a clear cooling-off period of 1 year, which we had honored, rather than a lifetime ban. Rules that would prevent the next person from having to choose between their career and their heart. Part 7. After James didn't leave medicine, but he did leave that hospital. He realized he couldn't work in a place that had been so ready to villainize him. He took a job at a private research institute in San Francisco. focused on cancer treatment innovation and immunotherapy. It offered better hours, a better environment, and colleagues who judged him on his research, not his personal life. A place where his ethics wouldn't be questioned because he fell in love with someone he'd saved. We moved in together. We bought a house in Oakland with a wildly overgrown garden. It was the kind of normal, domestic life James had given me the chance to have. And now we were sharing it. We fought about whose turn it was to do the dishes. We argued about what color to paint the living room. We dealt with the mundane, beautiful problems of being alive. On our second anniversary 3 years since that lecture, for years since my remission began, he took me back to the coffee shop where we'd had our first date. It was raining again. "I want to do something," he said. Pushing aside his coffee cup, he got down on one knee on the scuffed wooden floor. The barista looked over, surprised. "I've spent my career telling people about survival," James said, his eyes locking onto mine. "About statistics and remission rates and life expectancy. I lived my life by numbers. But the most important statistic is this: you're alive. You're here. And against every rule, against every odd, you chose me. After everything, you chose to fight for us." He pulled out a simple silver ring. "Will you marry me, Samuel?" I looked at the man who had seen me at my absolute weakest and loved me anyway. "Yes," I said. 1,000 times yes. Epilogue. 3 years after that proposal, we were getting married. We didn't do it in secret. We didn't hide. We did it in a vineyard in Napa, under the open sky. In front of everyone, his new colleagues, my friends from the architecture firm, our families. Even Dr. Evans was there. All the people who'd supported us through the impossible. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the vines. I stood at the altar, looking at James. He was crying. The man who had trained himself to show no emotion for decades was letting tears stream down his face. In my vows, I talked about what it meant to be a patient, to be vulnerable, to trust someone with your life when you are terrified, and then, against all odds, to trust them with your heart when you are safe. In his vows, James talked about the honor of being a doctor, about how the greatest privilege isn't healing someone's body. It's being present for their transformation. It's watching them go from believing they're going to die to believing they're going to live. And then, he said, his voice breaking, "Sometimes, if you are the luckiest man in the world, you get to build that life together." We danced to a song about survival, about beating the odds, about the miracle of simply being in a room, breathing with the person you love. As we spun around the dance floor, I rested my head on his shoulder. I thought about that first appointment years ago. I thought about the cold room, the smell of antiseptic, and the moment Dr. Mitchell told me my scans were clear. I had thought that was the happy ending, the moment the cancer stopped, but I was wrong. That was just the beginning. This warmth, this music, this future stretching out before us, this was the real happy ending. Not just survival, but thriving. Not just remission, but a life worth living, with the person who taught me how to fight and then taught me how to love.